Hello, welcome back. And this American church history, this will be our last class. We've tried to cover, everything that's in the book, but as we see, we're almost more than halfway through, but we're not going to be able to finish everything. So the rest of it, you can study it yourself and look into those materials. And what we left off is discussing solemn witch trials in the colonial America. And it has to do with the religious tolerance between the state and the church, and then within the church itself. So the issue of tolerance or religious freedom comes to these matters. If the state begin to involve regarding the citizens' religion, it becomes an issue. For example, Today we have some countries that say they have religious freedom, but actually in reality persecute a church. And the law says you can have this kind of religious group, and you cannot have this place you can have this place to worship, but anywhere else is illegal. So that when that happens, as state is controlling a church. Again, most these Muslim countries, what we see today happening in Afghanistan, at the fall of Afghanistan, or we could say, Taliban comes in and takes over. As they do take over the state, the Taliban government is going to rule according to the Quran, the law, the religious law. Same thing happening in Iran and Saudi Arabia. These nations, they believe the state is same as the religion, not the church, but no, religion. And then church against the church. We Christians believe every believer is a church by itself, or himself or herself. So church versus church is a correct statement. Again, you have certain belief that might be different from your denomination or your local church or your pastor. Then does it become an issue? Yes, it may. It may. If you believe in something else other than the Bible teaches. For example, you're believing in Jesus Christ, but say Jesus Christ is not the same as the Father God, but he is the second God, even though he is in the place of Trinity. Or if you believe in the resurrection, but not actual resurrection, but you believe in only the idea of resurrection, then we have a trouble. We have problem. So that's why there is something called a creed. Creed is it's a summary of our faith. All Christians, so-called Christians, should agree. And if you believe something else, then that you're identified and labeled as heretic or a cult, and you're not one of us. But otherwise, a church against church. The problem with the solemn witch trials and so on, so similar incidents at the time, is they did not have common creed. They did not have, and even though they had the Bible, their interpretation may differ from one to another, and there's nothing that says this is what we should believe if we are Christian, and if we confess that, we are okay. But they did not have that at the time. Oh, so church versus other religion, church versus church, state versus church. If Christian says other religion is garbage, I mean, you could say that, but that's not the proper attitude. Unless the other religion attacks the Christian, then you have a right to defend, but you have no right to disrespect other religion, other believers. If you do not respect, there's going to be consequences, just like we find in the history. The Salem witch trial is one. A killing of Native American is, because they were called savage, meaning beast. See, they are not beasts. They're just the same human being as you are. Only thing is they do not yet know who God is. They do not yet know who Jesus Christ is. And our job is to share that, not to force them or not to make them believe. That's not, it doesn't sound right. Make them believe is like a saying, 4 squared circle. 4 squared circle, does that exist? It cannot. So you cannot force someone to believe. It's not belief if you're forced. You can make them to agree to certain ideology or philosophy that might work, but you cannot make them believe in some God or faith or than nature. So this is how it looked like witch trial. The funny thing is, I believe this 170 who were accused and being imprisoned and killed were, I believe, 100% woman. So that not only has to do with the faith, but it has to do with a gender issue as well. Because at the time they believed that the woman are vulnerable to Satan's evil temptation. The reason they believe so is because the Bible records it was the Eve, the woman who's been tempted by the serpent to eat that forbidden fruit, the fruit of knowing the knowledge of good and evil. See, because of that, they believed it's a woman who's vulnerable to the devil, and thus witch trial, 100% of the cases were against woman. So are they witches? Yeah. this is the painting of someone, and that's how they portrayed it, how they imagined which to be look at their expression and the eyes and so on. Okay, let's go to chapter 2, and as they were coming toward the end of this colonial period, toward the time of revolution against the English, there's a great awakening. This awakening is not like a political, it's a spiritual one, it's a religious one, it's a purely a spiritual event. But the thing is, this awakening had affected, influenced, made a great impact toward the community they live in. So there are basically two great awakening in American church history, and this is the first one. It's a series of spiritual renewals, series of spiritual renewals. And no one had intended, but it had happened. And we believe it is work of the Holy Spirit. It is the Holy Spirit who began, initiated, and had the involvement in this movement. And God had His reason to make it to happen. It's not so much of human history, it is history of the Holy Spirit. Just like the book of Acts. In the beginning of the Acts, there's a great awakening among the people. 3,000 and 1,000 were converted. They were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So the same thing happens within the history. And most of the ethnic churches experience the same exact phenomenon as the initial Pentecost. So this is one of the sort of the Pentecost. And it expands the evangelical faith. So evangelical faith again is a Bible-believing faith. Liberals, they do say that they do believe in the Bible, but they do not believe in the whole Bible. They only select certain portion of Bible to believe. So that's not Bible believing. When we say Bible believing, it means we believe in the authority of the total whole Bible, the inspiration, and we believe the every word of the Bible has been inspired by God. That does not mean every word in the Bible it is saying the truth, because some of the portion of the Bible that has nothing to do with God, and it is there to just put the narrative on. So anyway, the evangelical faith believes in the full inspiration and full authority. So the evangelical confession, the creed, always say the Bible is the only authority for our faith and behavior. See, so that's how we believe. That when you say it and when you believe it and you can consider yourself as evangelical. So that's expansion of evangelical faith by Great Awakening. So to understand these kind of events, these very historical and spiritual events that happen, not just one incident and a series of renewals, then you need to look at the backgrounds to find out its meaning. There was some religious steering, not only the issue of state and the church, but we see the state of what the church did to the Native Americans, the massacre that happened by the church, the political authority and the church going hand in hand. In the name of protection, they killed, massacred hundreds and thousands of Native Americans. So that killing was justified in the name of church as well. So that's a sad thing. And also witch trial, it says they did not have that good absolute standard or Puritans, pilgrims, piety ideals as they were coming from the Europe, the England to America. So that means they lost that purity of true Christianity, true religion. So there are these religious stories. And then there are events of many denominations, and with the having many denominations happened heresies, the cults. They who were teaching different things than the gospel. So that's the event of religious theory. And then political struggle against England. The church, the state, all together were going against England because as the English officially established English colonial under the name of Great Britain. Also the Anglican Church tried to have their authority over the colony and extend their influence within the colonial territory. As it happened, the church in America, the colonial America, were against not only the England as a political power, but as Anglican Church, as a religious authority. They did not want that to happen. See, we saw that Rhode Island and then Pennsylvania declared religious tolerance, meaning the Anglican Church no longer would have any authority over the religious matters. So as that happened, there was that struggle, and it becomes an issue. And the political struggle within the colony. So as couple million settlers come in from the Europe, it's going to be chaotic. These new people coming in by ship, thousands and thousands, every month. And that means you need a new territory and new houses, more materials, and more food, and all these necessities. And it takes political government or governing. So when there's a need for to govern, and government is, it's a must, it's inevitable. But when you do not have proper government, what happens? The pandemic, you cannot have the control over the pandemic because you do not have proper, appropriate government. And then Afghan, you cannot even fight against this guerrilla group. they're just small and militant power, and you have all the equipment and all the numbers of soldiers, but you, without that proper government, it's nothing. It's just junk. So we know that there's always a need for a good government. The problem is, what is a good government? Think of your own countries that you came from. And do you think you have a good government? And some may say yes, and some may say no, even though you came from the same country. See, not 100%, not everyone agrees to the government that he or she is in. And there's different opinions. At least 50% of Americans are not satisfied with the current government, and 50% of Americans were not satisfied with the past government, the Trump government. So there's always that difference. And the job of government is to try to satisfy every single people under their government. But no, that's not going to happen. That's ideal. But the thing is, as people came in, new people came in every day, like every month, from Europe, speaking very different languages and having different cultures, you have a big issue. The governing is not going to be that easy. And then decline of Puritans. Like I told you that the Puritans grew in numbers. When you begin to grow in numbers, what happens is you lose the initial spirit, and you become corrupt. Corrupt in a good way and a bad way. And corrupt means that you change. That's one way of corruption. You change the idea. Another corruption is like a money, greed, and power, greed, and so on. So that's another kind of corruption. So the decline is actually inevitable. Any church that grew big, including the Catholic churches and so on, it becomes corrupt. That's why some congregationalists trying to have the smallest unit of authority, the local churches. And when it's the local church, it's only local church that's going to be corrupt. And it is difficult to do so because there are a certain number of people that you can manage. But if it goes beyond, like a mega church, well, we see the corruption of the leaders, the corruption of church that we see today, even within like a Baptist churches where the who are the basically congregationalists and separatists, the mega churches that are the ones who are falling into the corruption. So the data says the bigger the church, they are more vulnerable, open to the corruption and the decline, therefore. So there is no church that became big and grew, did not decline. So decline of a church or the group of denomination is inevitable, and that happened to Puritans. So the decline of Puritans means a decline of Puritan spirit, the very evangelical idea, and then there need to be the need for reform. See, these are some of the words, the ideas that has to do with awakening. So when we say spiritual awakening, it takes a reformation, reform. It takes a renewal, and it takes a revival. So these are the key elements that had to happen in the time of this great awakening. So there was need for reform, need for renewal, and the need for revival as the church declines. And then there is a very secular influence coming from Europe to church. Many of later immigrants, other than the Pilgrims and the Puritans, their reason for coming to the States once the colony was established officially was not religious. It has nothing to do with the faith. Even though many of them, probably most of them, were Christians by their nation, Lutherans, Anglicans, and so on. But their primary motive, the reason for coming to America, was to live a better life. When they say a better life, it's not so much of the quality, but it is of quantity. So they can earn money and become rich and live a good life. So a very secular reason, secular idea, that's different from the biblical ideal. That was the reason for them to come to America and to live, leaving their own country. See, unless you have very, very good reason to leave, you don't leave your brothers and sisters and relatives and your own culture and language and come to another country with a strange culture and the language. It takes a lot of effort to become an immigrant. So it costs you. It's going to cost you. You have to leave something and you have to acquire new things. It takes a lot of effort, energy, and difficulties. So, who would do that? Unless you have something in your heart to believe, or you have something so-called greed. So many came later on for the greed, because they heard there's a good land, a vast land, where you can become rich. So, and then lack of schools. The modern education that we see in America is not something of aged. It's pretty new, actually. The modern education that we see in America is not old. It's really new. So in the time of colonial America, especially in the colonial America, the school system was very poor. And not only the quality of the school itself, but the number of schools, the place of education was very limited. Many times, the church in the town, usually they build the church in the center of the village. And the church becomes the school during the day, during the weekdays. And then weekends, it becomes a church. So the church served as the place of worship and also place of education. And then that education done in a school. they did not have the many churches, usually one or two at the most, small villages. I mean, think of these rural, the farming towns, even in modern America. They are small. The population is just a couple hundred, or somewhere around 1,000. So they did not need that many schools, and then they could not have the good school system from elementary to high school. I mean, the colleges even beyond. So usually they had only learn to read and learn to write. That was about it. And so the schooling was poor, and the lack of schools, it became, I mean, the issue for the community. And then we have lack of qualified ministers. At the colonial America, and even until the Second Awakening, actually, the ministers were limited. There were like no formal seminary. I mean, seminary is a very recent invention, actually. So who became the pastors? The church got together and they prayed together and elect one who is qualified to be the minister. And these ministers are not full-time. They're only ministers at during the weekdays. So when you see some of these Hollywood movies, the cowboy movies, there's a scene where the sheriff has a gun, and then he takes off the gun and put on a gown and performs the marriage ceremony as a pastor. So that was like common. That's no strange thing that in America. That means there's no professional ministers, just lay ministers. They preach and teach on Sundays because they are more mature than others. So elders in the Presbyterian churches, they took turn to preach on Sundays. And even today, the brethren tradition, they do not have the pastor. It's an official, like a designated paid full-time pastors. They don't do that. They don't have that. Any of them that are led by the Spirit is able to come to the pulpit and preach. So you got to understand these traditions to understand the American church today. So the lack of ministers, it means qualified. If you are lacking the qualified ministers, means your church is more likely be a church that is lacking proper quality as well. So that becomes a very serious issue, and I think that God said to himself, I gotta do something about these people if I try to establish my kingdom properly on earth. And God must said, I love America because these are the people of faith and they are genuine ones, and I want to support them. And probably the first awakening was the one way that God had decided to support. With this background, there is something called catalytic factors. I mean, that sparks the fire. And these are some of those. Okay, why don't we come back for this after the short break? Okay. Okay, we are back, and that catalytic factors or triggering factors for this first great awakening in American church. First is prayer. There was always people who are praying seriously, praying with a sincere heart. When there is a prayer, God, He has to listen, and He does answer. He answers through prayer. Of course, God can work whatever He wants to, but God works not better, but God works with glad heart when there's people who are praying. And as we see, the church is declining. There's some secular, influence coming into the church, and divisions, and also, witch trials and these things going on, and it's chaotic, and they do not have proper ministers to, deliver the message. And they knew that church is declining. And when the church is declining, there are band of prayer people rising. And that happened. You can name hundreds and hundreds of incidents that where the church began to pray for God's intervention. God intervenes when people ask for it. So people ask for it, and first as the prayer, then there becomes mobilization of lay leaders. Since there are only few handful of church leaders who are being formally educated for the ministry, most of the church had to utilize the church leaders, the lay leaders for the church to operate and to make discipleship and to do the evangelism and so on. And even the preaching was done, like I said in the class, done by lay leaders. Today, preaching is usually permitted only to the professional preachers who has the degree or the training at least. But at the time, the lay leaders were preaching, and then they begin to mobilize to do the reform, renewal, and revival. And the first sign of the Great Awakening, the actual movement, is done by visitations. There are several different visitations, but visitation by the professional, the ministers. So there is something called this, circling pastor, who's going from one church to another church on Sundays and preaching at the church. There are some of these pastors, traveling pastors on Sundays in some rural areas in America still. But at the time, that became like a popular thing. So one pastor will go visit 2 or 3 different villages to preach at the different time schedule. And so that's kind of visitation that we are talking about. And as they visit, there were work of discipline or discipleship. Lay people began to get some training, formal. I mean, it's not like a seminary, but they had this Bible classes. And so it became kind of a tradition and system of being disciplined or learning. As they were educated and in the schools, they learned to read and write, and because they are able to read and write, they were able to be educated and discipled according to the Bible. So lay people becomes more knowledgeable and in the biblical knowledge. So these all contribute to this big boom of revival or awakening. There are some key people: William Tennant, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edward. And so let's look at each one of them, who they are, what they did for the Great Awakening, the first Great Awakening of America. In 1727, Tennant is William Tennant. I think William was a very popular name at the time. Many of them we see our first names are William. Anyway, this William Tennant established a religious school in a log cabin that became famous as the Log College. So, as a religious school, not just learning to read and write, but it means they begin to teach Bible. Nothing else at the beginning. It was just Bible, not theology or doctrine. That comes much later. And but they begin to teach Bible, and that tradition continues until today. So we have something called Bible College. The schools where you only teach Bible and the theology and doctrine, nothing else. And then it stands as a college. Usually it's 2-year college. So this Bible schools or Bible college becomes, the beginning of the Bible college, Bible schools is this log cabin by William Tennant. We don't know, I don't know exactly what the curriculum was, but the significance of it is this is the very first one that we know of. He filled his pupil, with evangelical zeal, and a number become revivalist preachers in the first Great Awakening. So, this school, when you establish a school, that means you are raising people. And you're just not giving just the information, but the spirit. You inspire them. See, again, that word, inspiration, is a key to any Christian education. So, same thing I'm doing. I'm teaching American church history for the summer quarter. But I'm not here to inform you of the knowledge, the information, the facts. But I'm more here for the inspiration. So you ought to be inspired what the meaning of American church history is to you. So the first Bible school or Bible college, he taught them the evangelical zeal, the biblical, spiritual zeal, the enthusiasm. And then many of them become revivalists, aiming to revive the church, and also preachers in the church. And they become the key people to this first great awakening. So even though God is the one who initiates, and then when he leads these revivals, the great awakening, historical revivals, he cannot do it without people. Of course, he is powerful, he can do everything, and he is able to do it. But he rather choose not to do it by himself. But he chose to use every single people who are committed and devoted in this big movement, with this initiative. So, to do so, there has to be a person or people who vision to raise people. The problem with raising people, it is not only costly, it does take money to educate people, but it takes time. It does not happen overnight. It takes years of training and learning to raise one good person. So the idea of discipleship is long term. It does not happen. It's not instant fast food. And we need the people with that vision. And I want you to, I'm challenging you to be that person who is going to be inspired and devote your life to raising people. The thing with raising people, there's one downside to it, is most likely you're not going to be recognized as, just like we do with William Tennant. You are not going to be remembered. You're not going to be even appreciated by the students, the disciples that you disciple. They'll be on their own, and most of them just forget who were the teacher was. So don't expect to be remembered or to be appreciated. Do you think that Jesus was appreciated as much as he has done? We see that he was not. Everyone just ran away, and when Jesus was captured, and only one was even one who followed was the bad one. He was not perfect. The Peter, when he was encountered, and then he said, "No, I do not know this guy," and he also just hid himself, denied Jesus 3 times. So that was the case, but it's not people who's gonna give you the credit. It's God who's gonna give you the credit and say you are the faithful servant. So I challenge you, some of you Christian who are attending this class, learn from the lesson and be the disciple maker. Charles Chauncey. He was educated at Westminster School, then at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he later was a lecturer in Greek. So now we begin to have this learned characters, the preachers and the pastors, the professional theologians. During his time at Plymouth and Churchet, Chauncey got into a heated debate with the religious and secular leaders of the Plymouth colony over the issue of baptism. So the baptism becomes one of the key issues triggering the Great Awakening. And Charles Chauncey was in the middle of it. And Shubal Stearns, he is another guy that's heavily involved in the triggering of this Great Awakening, First Awakening. He converted after hearing George Whitefield. George Whitefield was the traveling, one of those traveling preacher and revivalist. We call them revivalist. And then planted a Baptist church in Sandy Creek. This Sandy Creek, it sounds familiar, right? That's where the shooting happened. I'm not sure if it's the same Sandy Creek, but there are multiple towns with the name Sandy Creek, but it's the same name. Guilford County, North Carolina. Stearns' highly successful ministry was related to the rise and the expansion of the separate Baptist. Two missing two. It's a separate Baptist. So Shubal Stearns is one of the church leader, and who one of the great the leader of this Great Awakening, who's been influenced by Whitefield. Deborah Jarrett, influential evangelical leader in Virginia's Anglican Church in the 18th century. So now we are in the 18th century Virginia, and this is Anglican Church leader. Okay? At a time when critics regarded Virginia's official denomination as lifeless, and many of these persons as little more than bureaucrats. Jarrett summoned his parishioners to a heartfelt devotion to Christ. What it means, there's a church, Anglican Church, a state church, who's becoming very bureaucratic, authoritarian, and it's very formal and nominal. This nominal, when it is used in a Christian context, it means name only. It's just surface, not real, fake. It's a nominal church, nominal Christians. So it's full of nominal Christians. They come to Sunday to worship, but it's just formal social activity. They come to church as a custom, as a culture. There's no true heartfelt worship. See, as they consider them as bureaucrats, meaning they did not have that heart. So it's not genuine, no, not true Christian. Sadly, the same thing happens in the church today. As church becomes something of prestige, something of the noble people thing, then, many those who has money and educated come to church because it's some noble thing to do. That happened in Korea. As the church becomes the majority. One time, less 25-30% of the Korean population was known to be Christians. That's a lot. And so the church becomes just popular thing of the trend. And many who are educated, learned this, and the rich and famous come to church, especially the politician. These people, they need the vote. And the church is a good place to earn this political vote, popular vote. When that happens, church becomes corrupt. The church becomes nominal. And that happened there. When that happens, it takes awakening. You need to just redo it, everything. So as an outcome of Great Awakening, what we see is a new denominations. So not only just Baptist, we have something called separate Baptist, who has separated themselves from the original Baptist. And then we have this Methodist. The history of Methodist is very important in understanding American church. Not only the First Awakening, but the evangelical movement in America, because it started with what we call holiness movement. Is probably another, it can be like used as another name for Great Awakening. The holiness movement became necessary because the church was no longer holy. It becomes formal. It's a culture. Everyone comes to church on Sunday. 99% of the town comes to the church every Sunday to worship. That's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing that they come to church, but it's a bad thing. Many just come to church as a duty, as an obligation, as a culture, as a social activity, and it's a community thing. And the church loses holiness. The very core, the center of Christian spirituality, the holiness. Another word, holiness is godliness. It is like God, to become like God, toward the image of God. That's the center of Christian spirituality. And people come to church and worship and make do the praise and all these things without pursuing the true image of God. Another way to put it, the truth with the all capital letters. So that's only the truth. I mean, the biblical truth is the image of God, the godliness and the holiness. These are the same thing. You want to be like, I mean, you are created in the image of God, and then you need to recover this. That's the reason for becoming a Christian and then coming to the church to worship and being a church. So, Methodists, later become Methodists, are those who were starting and involving this holiness movement, and started by the John Wesley and Charles Wesley. So Wesleyan, we call Wesleyan that they are the beginning of Methodist denomination. Then new emphasis on mission. As a result of Great Awakening, people not only become aware of the identity of the church, but the work of the church, the reason for church. Why was church necessary? The question is, I mean, if God is God, and if God saved us, why don't He take us right away to heaven, but leave us here on earth as in the name of church? So the answer is, because God wants us to extend His kingdom. And they realized it is God's will for us to go out and preach. I mean, to share the gospel and bring the lost people to His kingdom. So that's called evangelism. And with that evangelism, church is there to make this world a better place to live, for those who are believing and for those who are not believing, for the same. That's God's will until the real final kingdom comes for the good, as Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, comes back as the second coming of Messiah. But until then, in between first coming and second coming, we remain here on earth as a church. And our job is to make this place a better place, this much, a little bit better place today than yesterday. But to do so, church needs to be holy. Church needs to be godly. And it needs to live and abide by the image of God, pursuing it. And that translates into the mission. The mission is basically what church does for the world, serving the world to make it a better place, whether they believe God or not. So, realizing that by awakening, they wake up and now understand and know it is our job. The church has to do missions. So the new emphasis on mission. Then with the evangelism, the mercy works. There's always poor and needy. The orphans and widows. They're the ones who cannot survive without outside help. Those who can survive without outside help, they don't need the mercy. But there are always that group of people in society where we live in, because this the world that we live in is not perfect. And there are always the people who are vulnerable to this poverty and all the dangers. They cannot save themselves. When there are those people, it is church who are to go out and share whatever the church has. You see that, church in America, most of the church in America are rich. They have more than they need. So still, today it's the same story. But at the time, as they are awakening again, spiritually, they saw those needs and they realized it is our job, our responsibility, our mandate to serve them, to feed them, to protect them, to shelter them. So they did. And that's, again, the social concerns. And addition to the mercy work, what the social concerns involved is as people move to America and this colony becomes more settled down, and the millions and millions of people come from Europe, what happens is society becomes rather more complex. There are many different ethnic groups and the language groups, and there are all these multiple cultures, and with a very different background, social, religious. And then the issue of social justice, because this is they're pursuing the new America, new land, a new utopia. And the ideal thing is everyone lives rich and abundant and happy. But in reality, not everyone is happy. They are no more happier than when they were in Europe. When that happens, they're gonna have this question: what can we do about this? And that social justice becomes a very issue. And those who are concerned with this is called social concerns. Today, the church still faces these social concerns, including justice, equality, and then gender issues, LGBTQ. All these issues are social concerns. Abortion. See, church cannot resolve and finish and complete these issues that's occurring from time to time, continuing to happen in history. But we can make it better. We can make it not to go worse, just like a salt does to the food. So that's where the church is standing until God finally, eventually makes it happen, the complete, perfect, the kingdom of God. Until then, we continue to struggle against this evil. And then all these social issues are not just political, it's not just the government. Church has to take a major part, as much as the state is, for the healthy society and healthier culture. So I could say with the 100% confidence that church is the key component and the key entity for the responsible for the health of society. So when society goes bad, it means church went bad. When society is weak, we know that church is weak. So it goes together. And as we see what happened in America and globally today, I can say the church is not doing her part. Then again, non-Calvinistic theologies. The Calvinistic or Reformed theology was the major theological trend in America, in the colonial times especially. And the Presbyterian, Anglican, it is Catholic, tradition, and then you Reform, the German and the Calvinistic tradition was the pillar of the theology. And that has changed as we experienced the Great Awakening. And that influence of first Great Awakening, the theological shift, we say shift, is still effective until today. And it continues to influence our theological discussion and thoughts. So not only it changes the surrounding reality, it changes the thought, the ideology, and the spirit. That's what the awakening does. And we had another awakening later dates in the 20th century, the beginning of 20th century. And then we may have the third awakening. Some say already we had third awakening, but I think the third awakening will come by the end of 21st century, by toward the end of 21st century. So we can kind of predict what is going to happen in the future, but the history tells us the church should continue to do what it is obligated and mandated to do. And we are part of it. And some of you are part of it. And so I hope and pray that you guys who are really listening to this historical lessons to make a change in your life, in your vision, in your ministry. Okay, that will be my concluding word. And thank you. And thank you for coming to this American church history, and I hope that you have learned something from it and be inspired by some of the words that I shared with you. And probably I'll see you in some other class, but have a good vacation, and thank you.